So for our first story, a growing movement pushing towards secession starts to build within the good old party. So there have been growing talks about secession from within the GOP for a little while now. For the most part, they haven't been taken very seriously. I think that you see every now and then there are secession talks that come from either side of the aisle once every couple of decades, or maybe once every single time that a certain political party actually falls out of power. And for the most part, most Americans don't necessarily take it very seriously, because I think most Americans sitting in their current place can't really imagine a situation that would come about where a portion of America actually decided to secede from the Union. However, I will say there's a portion of the GOP that actually is pushing towards it, and it's gaining a lot more steam and more momentum than we previously had thought. So there are a lot of people on the right side of the aisle that think that the fracturing within the country as it currently sits is growing more and more day by day. Many point to the growing differences between the two parties and the agendas that both of them push, because objectively, the far left and the far right push very, very different agendas. Okay? Politics have always been incredibly diverse and incredibly divisive in America, because there have always been people in this country that have very, very different views from one another, right? Especially as to how the government should run. It stems from a wide variety of different differences in lifestyles, religion, values, race, socioeconomic statuses, and much more. America legitimately is a melting pot, and it kind of always has been that way. There have always been small pockets of people, however, that have kind of pushed towards secession. We've only had one time in our country, as many of you know, where that small portion of people actually grew to a group that was large enough to actually move for secession, and that ended up in a bloody civil war. So whenever a party doesn't, maybe their party falls out of favor, or they're not winning the specific amount of elections that they want, there's a small group that'll be like, oh, well, we should push away, we should secede from the Union. So great example of this is in 2008, 2009, the former governor of Texas, Rick Perry, openly discussed secession as a solution to the Obama being elected president multiple times. And plenty of people within the Jim Crow South as well also tossed around the idea of secession when the federal government mandated integration, especially within schools. Many at that point in time, especially within the southern states, a lot of the southern Democrats decided that secession was the only way that they'd be able to fix the problems within America, because there were too diverse of opinions about how America should proceed going forward. However, I will say in these conversations now are starting to become much more mainstream, especially in right-leaning circles. And I think more so than they have a lot of times in the past. Even when you saw in Democratic circles in the Jim Crow South, people pushing for or saying that secession would be a good idea in order to repair some of the divisiveness that was occurring within the country at the time, it wasn't on mainstream Democratic airwaves, at least that I have been able to find or in any of the research that I've done. Granted, I was not alive during the 1950s and 60s, so maybe that was incredibly prevalent amongst Democratic talking circles and maybe more mainstream Democratic news. However, you're starting to see secession talks within Republican circles and Republican pundits, political pundits especially, actually pushing towards secession as a legitimate thing that could happen. Now it's starting to take a step in a very real way. So a study done by Brightline Watch Group, made up of researchers from Dartmouth, the University of Rochester, and the University of Chicago, released a study that they did over a couple months. They released it in February, that found that 1/3 of all Republicans said that they would support secession. And then I also found that of the Republicans within the former Confederacy, so within the southern states primarily, the Deep South, and then also tacking on Kentucky and Oklahoma, who were not part of the Confederacy, 50% of those Republicans supported secession, or something that looked like secession. This past month, a bill was actually proposed in the Texas legislature that would allow for Texans to vote on whether or not to secede. So there are bills being pushed forward in state legislatures of primarily Republican states that actually move towards secession. So let's hop in real quick and let's listen to this video. It was reported out of San Antonio news station, actually talking through a bit about this bill.
Now at 10, a Texas independence bill filed in the state house today. Representative Kyle Biederman, a Republican from Fredericksburg, is behind the bill. It is not a resolution to make Texas secede from the United States immediately. Instead, it would let Texans vote on whether the state legislature should create a committee to develop a path toward independence. Biederman announced the bill filing in a tweet today saying, quote, "For decades, the promises of America and our individual liberties have been eroding. Now is the time for the people of Texas to have the right to decide their own future," end quote. He also used the hashtag Texit.
Right. So this bill specifically, the idea behind it would be to create a committee that would lay out the steps that would need to be taken in order to actually secede from the Union and for Texas to declare its independence. This is the first legitimate bill that has been proposed to take steps towards secession since the Civil War. And it was not denounced by the Texas governor, Rick Abbott, at all. He never once came out and said that this was a bad bill that needed to be thrown out. He never talked against this bill specifically. And the state GOP actually endorsed the bill. It stood behind the guy that proposed it. Okay? So very real. I mean, that is the state GOP actually endorsing a movement towards secession there in Texas. There are also plenty of right-leaning political commentators that are also lending a lot of credence to secession talk. So Glenn Beck, he's a very conservative political pundit and head of The Blaze and The Blaze TV, which is a extremely, kind of far right-wing or more conservative talking, like political talk show. And they said in mid-December of last year that he would vote for secession. That's Glenn Beck. Multiple employees at The Blaze have also tweeted out their support for secession. So that is someone that is on their airwaves and has a very, very large following of conservatives in America that is saying that he would push towards a move of secession. So it is clear from a legal standpoint that secession is not legal at all. For a while, especially leading up to the Civil War, there were a lot of talks about whether or not states had the right to actually secede from the Union if they saw fit, and the legal precedent is there. That, of course, is absolutely illegal, and the Civil War shows that. The late Justice Antonin Scalia actually came out and had a really, really interesting, basically, argument and point around it, and basically was like, there's no way that there's any type, or Scalia, I don't know why I said Scalia. Scalia had a very, very interesting point where she talked through in an opinion piece about how the Civil War basically decided there is legal precedent for secession, and it is illegal for a state to secede. So that means that any acts or walks towards secession would then be an act pushing towards war. States do not have the right to vote to leave without it being an act of all-out aggression towards the United States of America. So growing talks of leaving the Union are and should be taken seriously. And there is no doubt that many Americans have been drifting apart. The bridge between the two the bridge between the two parties seems to be growing larger and larger. However, maintaining the integrity of the Union is, of course, of the utmost importance. I don't have to go through all the horrible impacts for everybody to realize how awful secession would actually be, and it obviously has already been tried once before, and that resulted in one of the most bloody wars that America has ever been through, especially in the terms of, actual American casualties. It makes me incredibly nervous. It makes me anxious. It worries me to think about the fact that there are growing circles within the American Republican Party that think that it is a good idea to entertain the talks of and lend credence to the view of secession. Breaking up the United States from any standpoint at all is an absolutely horrendous idea. Absolutely awful. Just because we live in a country with a plethora of incredibly diverse viewpoints does not mean this country cannot and will not continue to move forward and grow and be able to be governed by that group of people collectively. There's no reason why the United States has been able to last thus far, right, under the incredibly extenuating circumstances that the United States has come through over the past 200 years, and think that it doesn't have the opportunity to continue to go forward. There are just as many people with differing opinions now as there were in the early 1800s or mid 1800s. early 1900s and mid 1900s. Okay. We have, yes, a very, very diverse and different population in the United States that disagree on a lot of things. However, we have a system in place that works as a democratic republic to be able to lend credence to a wide variety of different voices and allow for the people to be able to govern themselves through representation within Congress and within the presidency. And that is a good thing. That it honestly blows my mind, breaks my heart that there are legitimately Republicans that are lending credence to the idea of secession. But that's the world in which we live right now. And I think that's why there needs to be more voices like this podcast and the people that listen to this podcast that are like, no, you know what, secession may not be a good idea. Maybe we should try to reach across the aisle a little bit, because that could be helpful also.